Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 218 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about the hidden origins of the Jewish school of mysticism known as Kabbalah. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Folks, Kabbalah is a school of Jewish mysticism that has been around for centuries. Today, it's experiencing a revival in popularity, with pop stars like Madonna and Ariana Grande becoming advocates of it. But there are controversies surrounding Kabbalah, or Kabbalah. One of them is its history. Kabbalists claim that its teachings go back more than 3,000 years. But modern academic scholars have challenged this. So what is the truth about Kabbalah? Where did it come from? And what happened in its turbulent history? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Jimmy, why did you want to do today's episode?
I've been aware of Kabbalah for a long time. In fact, before I was Catholic, when I was in my teens, I was a New Ager for a number of years. And during that time, I encountered Kabbalah and got a rather crude understanding of its teachings. As an adult, I've continued to study all kinds of religious views, including those of Kabbalah, both because I study religion and religious history as part of my work as an apologist, and because I study esoteric things as part of my research for Mysterious World. So for some time, I've been watching Esoterica, the YouTube channel of a Jewish scholar named Dr. Justin Sledge, and he discusses all kinds of different things that we talk about and will be talking about in future episodes on Mysterious World. He covers a lot of topics, but he's devoted a lot of attention to Kabbalah mysticism, so I decided it would be good to interview him on Mysterious World and let him give us an accurate scholarly presentation of Kabbalah.
And what should listeners know about today's show?
This will be a two-part discussion. Dr. Sledge and I had such a productive discussion that we talked for a little more than 2 hours, so I decided to divide the discussion in half to keep the episode from going super long. As a result, today we'll be discussing the origins and history of Kabbalah, and as you said, there is a controversy about how Kabbalah started. Practitioners of Kabbalah and academic scholars hold different views on the subject. We'll also cover major events in the rather turbulent history of Kabbalah, including a brief look at the most famous false messiah in Jewish history, a man named Shabbatai Zevi. Also, we'll be looking at how Kabbalah developed and how it's influenced modern Jewish movements like Hasidism. Next week, we'll be going over the teachings of Kabbalah, and that's when things get even stranger, because Kabbalah teaches some really weird things from the perspective of Christianity and from the perspective of traditional Judaism. So definitely look forward to hearing about that.
Excellent. I can't wait to hear from Dr. Sledge. Before we get to that, I'd like to take a moment to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Tom C., Michael O., James N., Eric B., and Mary N. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest. You can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by Fearvento Law PLLC, now assisting clients with expungements and set-asides of Michigan convictions. To learn more, call 231-202-3321 or go to fearventolaw.com, FIORVENTO law.com. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering contact lenses at low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com.
Dr. Justin Sledge was born and raised in a proud working-class Mississippi family. He earned his PhD in philosophy at the University of Memphis. He's a professor of philosophy and religion at several institutions in the Metro Detroit area and a popular local educator. On YouTube, he operates the channel Esoterica, which explores the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. The channel covers topics such as alchemy, magic, Kabbalah, mysticism, the occult, and more, using current academic scholarship scholarship. Dr. Justin Sledge, welcome to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. Thank you so much for having me, and looking forward to this conversation on the Kabbalah.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Other than what's in the bio I just read, is there anything you'd like us to know?
I belong to the Reconstructionist Jewish movement, which is a non-supernatural version of Judaism. So it's a little different than some other versions of Judaism, which can confuse people because I sort of look the look, right, with the yarmulke and the beard. And so sometimes people think, are you a rabbi? I'm like, no, I'm not a rabbi. I am married to a rabbi, but I'm not a rabbi myself.
Yeah, your wife is a rabbi.
My wife is a rabbi, that's right. The Reconstructionist movement, the Reform movement, the Conservative movement all allow for women clergy, which I think is ultimately a good idea. And so I belong to that movement. And what else to know about me? I study strange things and make weird videos for the internet.
So do I.
Yeah, it's not a bad living, all things told. Not a bad gig. So it's a lot of fun, and I get to hang out with cool people like you and have conversations about things like Kabbalah, which is a lot of fun.
Okay. Well, why don't we start with explaining the term Kabbalah, because it's unfamiliar to a lot of people. They may have heard it, and they may know it's a kind of Jewish mysticism, but where does the term come from? What does it mean etymologically?
So it comes from a Hebrew word, word root was shoresh, which just means to receive. So literally, you could probably translate it as tradition, right? So it actually just means tradition. So now, by tradition, what they mean is esoteric tradition, traditions that are not exoteric. Exoteric traditions are the common traditions we would have in Judaism, like how to light candles for Hanukkah, how to pray in the morning, how to keep kosher. Those are the exoteric traditions. These are specifically the esoteric, the hidden traditions within Judaism. And Kabbalah, as we know it, began to exist in the Middle Ages. I'm sure we'll get more into the origin of it, but it just means tradition. So it doesn't have a specific name.
I think there's a song about that. Tradition.
Oh, yes. yeah. The Fiddle on the Roof, classic scripture in Judaism. So it just means tradition. But anytime anyone refers to Kabbalah, or anytime anyone refers to themselves as a member of the Mukabbalim, they're referring to themselves as a Kabbalist. They're not traditionalists. They're referring to themselves as people who practice and or believe in this esoteric dimension of Judaism.
Yeah, and you just used a Hebrew word, mukabbalim, that would mean a practitioner of Kabbalah. Kind of the English equivalent, as you said, would be a Kabbalist. Right.
It's in the plural there, but yeah. So that would be a mukabbalah would be someone who does Kabbalah.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned you're Reconstructionist in Reconstructionist Judaism, and you said that's non-supernatural, but you do pray, for example, correct?
That's right. I do pray.
And are you a Kabbalist?
I'm not a Kabbalist. No, I would not consider myself a Kabbalist, which would mean in this case to say I don't subscribe to the belief of the antiquity of a lot of these beliefs, and I don't subscribe to the metaphysical nature of them. So no, I would not consider myself a Kabbalist. Now, of course, I always say that I'm not a Kabbalist, and everyone says, well, that's the same kind of thing a Kabbalist would say. So I can never really get around it. People are like, so you're not a Kabbalist? I'm like, no. It's like, that's a lot of Kabbalah books on your bookshelf for not to be a Kabbalist. I'm like, I study it academically, not religiously. Although I think, and this is maybe a difference between perhaps Christianity and Islam and Judaism, whereas in Christianity and Islam, the boundaries of the canon are quite fixed. What is and isn't scripture are pretty fixed by now. Of course, there's obviously exceptions with, for instance, the Church of Latter-day Saints or something. But in Judaism, the boundary of canon is a lot more porous. And what is authoritative in Judaism continues to evolve. And so if I'm studying my religion for religious reasons, then I would include all the texts we'll be talking about today as authoritative. Now, not authoritative in the sense that they can trump the Torah. There's an order of authority, but still authoritative in the sense that they are part of the tradition, and they deserve a seat at the table, but they, maybe not the head of the table.
Perhaps analogous to, say, the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas in Christianity. They're not on the level of scripture, but they're an important part of the tradition.
Yeah, I would say I think even higher than the writings of Thomas. Thomas became authoritative, although he wasn't in the 1270s. He was part of the same, the condemnation of 1277 applied to him as much as it did many other people. But I would say that the text of Kabbalah, the Sefer Zohar, the Sefer Yetzirah, the Sefer Bahir, I would say that they're probably on nearly equal footing as other texts in the canon.
Maybe more like an infallible document by a pope or an ecumenical council.
Yeah, maybe something like that. I mean, insofar as the Pope doesn't speak infallibly too often, but yeah,
he doesn't. Yeah.
No, it's pretty rare. I think last time I did it was
1950.
1950. Okay, was it on the Immaculate Conception or something? It was quite
the Assumption of Mary. I've done a study. I wrote a book on the magisterium and how it works and how to evaluate magisterial documents. And there's only something like 8 papal documents that have ever engaged infallibility.
Yeah, it's pretty rare. But, in Judaism, we have dozens of volumes that have gotten into scripture that way. So in that way, it's actually a lot looser that we have dozens of volumes that are considered so much so that we would consider them like sacred texts, which is to say you would not bring them into the bathroom with you. You would kiss them when you pick them up and put them down. You would treat them with reverence. They would be buried in a graveyard, just like you would other sacred scriptures. So yeah, they're relatively high ranking. And for Orthodox Jews, the Zohar, for instance, it's literally revealed. It's a revealed text. So they would consider it on par with any other revealed text in Judaism.
By the way, before we move on to the next question about Kabbalah, I wanted to tie up something for listeners who may not be familiar. You mentioned how in his own day, St. Thomas Aquinas didn't have the reputation he does now and was even subject to part of the condemnations of 1277. A lot of listeners won't know what that is. So basically, in the 1200s, as part of the Aristotelian revival, with all these new Aristotelian texts that were being translated into Latin and being discussed by Christian theologians and philosophers, some of them got ideas that were perceived as contrary to the Christian faith. And in 1277, the Bishop of Paris listed a bunch of propositions that were to be rejected, and some of them were actually ones held by Thomas Aquinas, though not all of them. It wasn't an attack on Thomas Aquinas. It was a general issue that was going on at the University of Paris at the time. And people may not be familiar with it, but actually Thomas Aquinas' reputation in his own day and for a time thereafter was not nearly what it came to be. He really got popular in reruns, as you might say.
Yeah, and most of the stuff was aimed at what is now called radical Averroism.
Yeah.
And Thomas was never an Averroist. So most of the Seeger of Brabant to people like that.
Right. So what are some of the biggest misconceptions that people have about Kabbalah?
So I think the biggest misconceptions that people might have when it comes to Kabbalah is that all Jews believe in it, which they don't. There are many Jews that reject Kabbalah. They say no, it's a fraud, or it was a medieval hoax. So it's still polarizing. Some are very into it, some are very against it. So that's one interesting thing about Kabbalah in that regard. Although I think another thing about it is that insofar as Judaism has anything like a systematic theology, to go back to Thomas or Hans Kung or something, insofar as Judaism really has a systematic theology, it would be some version of Kabbalah. Kabbalah in many ways has become the systematic theology of much of Orthodox Judaism. So in that way, it has a kind of authority. It also led to the greatest scandal in Jewish history, which was the false messiah Shabbatai Tzvi, where more than half of the world's Jews converted over to believing that Shabbatai Tzvi was the Messiah in the 17th century and packed their bags and were ready to go back to Palestine. And so in 1666, he converted to Islam, much to the horror of all those people and much of the happiness of everyone who thought he was a fraud. And so it also inspired one of the greatest catastrophes in Judaism as well. So it's had a very tortured history in the history of Judaism, and I think another thing that people may find interesting about Kabbalah is we often think of mysticism these days as a little hippy dippy. You kind of believe what you want. And, Kabbalah is incredibly rigorous when it comes to the Jewish law. In fact, it says that not only do you not get to pick and choose among the Jewish law must be so scrupulously followed precisely because it has metaphysical implications about reality and the coming of the Messiah. And so, unlike other forms of mysticism these days, where you think, oh, mysticism is kind of whatever you feel, Kabbalah is nothing like that. It is the most conservative branch of Judaism, or the most conservative interpretation of Judaism, and it demands rigorous, scrupulous attention to the law. In fact, so much so that laws that in the Middle Ages were sometimes even ignored, Kabbalah insists that they be given special emphasis. So, I think another thing people may not know is that the Kabbalah is probably responsible for the one prayer service that you've ever been to. If you've ever been to a synagogue on a Friday night, that service is called Kabbalat Shabbat, the reception, the receiving of the Shabbat, and all of the hymns for that service were developed by Kabbalists in the 16th century. So that is a situation where literally an entirely new prayer service. Jews traditionally pray 3 times a day. On Shabbat, there's a fourth that's added. And that fourth one is Kabbalat Shabbat. You can hear the word to receive the Sabbath is what that literally means.
Uh-huh.
And the most famous song that most people would ever have heard is Lecha Dodi, Come, O My Bride, and O My Beloved. And that song was written by 16th century Kabbalists. So most people who are not Jewish or not Orthodox, who've ever been to a service on a Friday night, you've participated in Kabbalah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
I have been to synagogue on a Friday night, and I did not know that service was specifically Kabbalistic.
Yeah, most people don't. And it's sort of one of these funny things. But even the order of the psalms that get sung are ordered in a particularly mystical way. So the entire service is deeply Kabbalistic.
Mm-hmm. By the way, just a note for listeners, we will, in all likelihood in the future, be having an episode on Shabbatai Savi, because it is a fascinating story and it has a big twist. So more than one.
I taught a whole class about him once, and it was a fun class because he's just such a. One could do a whole class just on failed messiahs, and that's just an interesting, and Shabbatai Savi being a very interesting example of one of those. So he's a fascinating character.
Now, people will likely have heard of different groups within Judaism that are kind of comparable to Christian denominations like Orthodox Judaism, Conservative, Reform, and Reconstruction. Is Kabbalah one of those, or is it more like a school of thought that crosses group boundaries?
Yeah, it's much more like the latter. Kabbalah is sort of like the general field of what we would call speculative theosophy. So not theology, like rigorous systematic theology. That never really took hold in Judaism, with the exception of Maimonides. But it's more like the speculation around the nature of God that cuts across all boundaries. So you would have Reform Jews, Reconstructionist Jews, Orthodox Jews, who all of them would be influenced by Kabbalah. In fact, if you go to a Reform synagogue, they will talk about Tikkun Olam, the reparation of the world. And in Reform Judaism, this typically is thought of as sort of doing things for the benefit of the world, like charity or social justice action, or helping out in the soup kitchen on Christmas Day so their Christian brethren can have the day off. And they would say, this is Tikkun Olam, the reparation of the world. But that idea is Kabbalistic. That idea comes right out of Kabbalah.
Mm-hmm.
So it exists in all spectrums and all denominations of Judaism, but like I said, there are also denominations of Judaism that completely reject it, that say that it's anathema.
Is Kabbalah something that its practitioners or adherents are completely agreed about, or is there a diversity of opinion and practice among Kabbalists?
These days, there's a lot more agreement, at least at the lower levels of discussion and practice. Now, at the higher levels of discussion and practice, there's still active disagreement. And historically, there have been separate schools of Kabbalah, but mostly during the 18th century, they were all fused into one generally accepted school of thought. That's changing a little bit now, and there have been some splits since then with things like the Kabbalah Center in Los Angeles and stuff like that. There's a lot of that's a very divisive topic, and so. But generally speaking,
we'll come back to that.
Yeah, we'll come back to it. So by the 18th century, Kabbalah was more or less systematized as it occurs now. So if you were to pick up a general introduction to Kabbalah from an ultra-Orthodox or Orthodox bookstore, you would probably get a pretty standard account of what's going on in Kabbalah generally. But historically, there were several divergent schools that did not agree with each other at all. Strongly disagree with each other. And eventually they were all absorbed into a system of Kabbalah that was pioneered and developed by a rabbi in the 16th century named Isaac Luria.
And we'll also talk about him. Yeah. So what do traditional Kabbalists believe about the origins of Kabbalah historically? Where do they think it came from?
So the traditional story of Kabbalah would be that it came from God, that it was actually part of the revelation at Mount Sinai. It was part of the oral revelation. Jews believe that there were two distinct combined revelations at Mount Sinai, the written Torah, which are the books of the Hebrew Bible, or at least the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. And then we have an oral Torah, and that is all the accounts of how to do all the stuff that's in the written Torah. And in that oral tradition, there is the idea, at least for Orthodox Jews, traditional Jews, that all of the ideas of Kabbalah were actually revealed there and kept secret. Moses learned them, taught them to Aaron, they taught them to Joshua, and they were preserved all the way down until they got to Shimon Bar Yochai, a 2nd century rabbi known for his extreme piety. In fact, the documents about him in the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud are very mixed. He's a very mixed character. But they traditionally ascribed to the idea that he was the last person to hold on to the Kabbalah as it descended from Moses. And then because basically the Jews were facing extinction, he taught it to a group of disciples. And those disciples disseminated it all the way up until the Middle Ages. And then in the Middle Ages, it was made public.
So for listeners who may not be familiar with the history of Judaism in this period, this is the 2nd century, and towards the end of the 1st century, the temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Romans, and that was in AD 70. And that was a really pivotal event for the development of Judaism, because now the sacrifices, which could only be offered at the temple in Jerusalem, could no longer be offered. And there was a big hope, especially at the time and still today, of rebuilding the temple in various Jewish quarters. And so there was a need to preserve the knowledge of, like, how did you do these sacrifices and how did you adjudicate various other legal issues that were connected with the temple or connected with life in 1st century Palestine. And so after the war, there was an effort to kind of set up a preservation movement. And in the 2nd century, Shimon Bar Yochai was one of the people involved in that preservation movement. And eventually it led to the writing of a set of tractates called the Mishnah, which attempt to preserve this earlier information that was not written in the Torah. And then the Talmud, which many will have heard of, is a set of commentaries on the Mishnah. Now, all of that is public or exoteric material, and it led to the formation of what's called today Rabbinic Judaism. But the Kabbalists, if I understand you correctly, are saying, okay, well, in addition to that oral Torah, which was also believed to have been given to Moses on Mount Sinai, there was, in addition to the exoteric Torah that you'll find in the Mishnah and the Talmud, there is also this esoteric or hidden oral tradition that they have. And Shimon Bar Yochai in the 2nd century was kind of the information bottleneck from which that knowledge then spread again.
Right. I think it may be a good analogy for this is just imagine there was some nuclear holocaust, God forbid, and there were only a few Americans left. And someone asked, well, I don't know, the 4th of July, how do we celebrate the 4th of July to preserve the celebration of the 4th of July for previous next generations? Well, you would ask yourself, well, do you get up in the morning? What is the first thing you do? Well, you prepare for the barbecue. And you're like, okay, what do I have to barbecue? Can you barbecue on a grill? What kind of grill? A gas grill or a charcoal grill? Do you have to shoot fireworks? How many fireworks do you have to shoot? Do you have to shoot ones? And so it's how loud can they be? And imagine trying to codify how to do something that you do every 4th of July or every Christmas, but the worry is, right, that your people are going extinct, and there may not be leadership to carry those traditions on. That's the Mishnah. The Mishnah is just an oral catalog of how to carry on Judaism, basically, if the entire leadership is going to be killed, because the Romans were hunting down and killing the Jewish leadership at the time. Mm-hmm. So, but yeah, you're exactly right. The idea is that Shimon Bar Yochai was thought to be the last repository of this sort of secret knowledge. And then in order to continue it, he taught all of his disciples this sort of secret knowledge. Now, that's the Orthodox story. And we do know that in the Talmud, there were forms of mysticism that they do mention. In fact, one of them is called Merkava mysticism. This is where one descends into the thrones of God and sees the palaces of God. And it's even obliquely mentioned in 2 Corinthians. It seems like Paul may have been instructed upon this stuff, where he says he knew.
What passage are you thinking of? Oh, you mean the ascent into third heaven?
Yeah. Where he says, I know a guy who was caught up to the third heaven. That language is very Merkava language. That's the kind of thing of Merkava, that the idea that there are tiers of heaven and that one can enter into them and one can be caught up to them. It seems likely to me that Paul had some instruction on this Merkava tradition, and maybe was even trained in it at some level.
Mm-hmm. It also has roots in the book of Ezekiel, because Ezekiel has this vision of God's throne/chariot or Merkava, and that's kind of the scriptural root from which a lot of this mystical exploration flows from.
Right. Yeah. And so this was a whole other form of mysticism that existed before the Kabbalah, in fact, at least according to academics. But eventually those forms of mysticism were also rolled up into Kabbalah also.
So Kabbalists believe that their tradition goes all the way back to Sinai. Mm-hmm. What has modern scholarship come to think about the origins of Kabbalah?
So it all hinges on what you mean by Kabbalah. And typically modern scholars mean a very specific thing about Kabbalah. They mean the traditions and speculations that follow from a text called the Sefer Zohar. The Sefer Zohar, or the Book of Radiance, is a pretty substantial volume of literature written in a very peculiar dialect of Aramaic that appeared in the 13th century in Spain around a circle of a rabbi named Moses of Leon. And that literature spawned Kabbalah as we know it. Now, the traditional story is that the Kabbalah, that text Sefer Zohar, goes all the way back to Mount Sinai via Shimon Bar Yochai. That's the traditional story. Modern scholars have taken the Sefer Zohar and examined it very, very carefully, and they're very skeptical of this story. The general academic position, and the position I hold, is that the Kabbalah as we know it really developed in southern France and in Spain, beginning sometime in the 12th and 13th centuries. And so all this literature, and there are more texts than just the Sefer Zohar. There's some other smaller texts and larger texts, but all of the literature as we know it coalesced in that time period and set the groundwork for the Kabbalah as we know it. So the traditional camp goes back to Sinai via Shimon Bar Yochai. The modern academic camp, it began in the Middle Ages. Now, there are also forms of Jewish mysticism that do go back to the Second Temple period, that do exist in the Middle Ages. But those are distinct from Kabbalah. So what I would say is we can think about Merkava Hechalot mysticism as a distinct form of mysticism prior to the Kabbalah. That's where you go into the heavens, you go on those mystical journeys. And the other is the Kabbalah proper, and that has to do with the Sefer Zohar and the text that was developed primarily in what scholars now think the 1270s, if you want to get a more exact number on it.
So if you picked up the Zohar and started reading it, what would you be reading? What kind of literature is it? Is it like a story or a legal code, or what would you find?
Yeah, the general framing of it is that it is a narrative in which Shimon Bar Yochai and his companions are traveling through the Galilee. And as they travel through the Galilee, they stop along the way and they discuss the Torah. And as they're discussing the Torah, they're not just discussing the regular Torah, they're discussing very mystical aspects of the Torah. So you can think about it as sort of like a narrative around a group of people traveling around having conversations. Now, there are various layers to it, some older and some later.
Kind of
them,
like the Canterbury Tales.
it's a bit Canterbury Tales-ish, not quite as highly structured as that, but yeah, a bit Canterbury Tales-ish. That the Canterbury Tales are about a century after the composition of the Zohar as we have it, but yeah, and part of how we know that we think it's a medieval composition is that they get all kinds of, the writer gets things wrong that a person living in the Galilee would never get wrong. For instance, they think some things are south where they actually are north, and some things west when they really are east. And sons-in-law and father-in-law get reversed, and they make strange errors in there. Also, the Aramaic that it's written in is a peculiar dialect of Aramaic, so peculiar that it seems to have been primarily developed by the writers of it. It's based on Palestinian Galilean Aramaic, so they're actually writing in a dialect of Aramaic that would have been used in the 3rd, 4th centuries. But it's so strange and ungrammatical that scholars are now fairly confident that it was artificially developed in the Middle Ages.
It's kind of like if people today tried to speak in Elizabethan King James English, or Jacobean, I guess I should say, English, they'd get it wrong. Yeah,
you would sound kind of right at first blush, and then you would realize, oh yeah, it would be something like, how doeth thy play baseball?
Yeah.
And you'd be like, baseball? There's no baseball in Elizabethan English, right? So yeah.
The missed pronoun thy.
No, right.
How
do thy? Yeah, or you would see all kinds of grammatical errors, and frankly, you just see Spanish words in there. So there's Spanish words that end up inside this Aramaic text that should be from the 2nd century. So yeah, you see mistakes that shouldn't be there. Now, the traditional position has explanations for all of that. They actually have they have arguments as to why that stuff is the way that it is, and I don't find those terribly convincing. But the traditional camp does have Zohar apologetics, where they do strenuously argue that there are good reasons why the text is the way that it is, and partly what they argue is it's an oral tradition that was written down, and it has an accumulated history, and so a lot of the mistakes are just part of the accumulation. Which, again, it's good to give them at least their fair share as to why they think it's in fact authentic.
Yeah. Do modern academic scholars have any guesses about who wrote the Zohar?
The general theory now is that it was probably written by the circle of people around a rabbi from Leon named Moshe de Leon. And we think it was probably primarily written by him and his circle. And we say him and his circle because there seems to have been, the text seems to reflect different attitudes about different ideas, and they're all edited together into one text. And it seems like there's slightly different dialects of this Aramaic in there, and there's slightly different emphasis on what they're focusing on. And it seems like it was all edited together at some point, 1270s, 1280s. And so generally speaking, we now think it wasn't one person writing it. That was the previous generation. Gershom Scholem previously thought that one person was responsible for the whole thing. The more modern scholarship tend to think of it sort of a horse built by committee. It's something more like that. It's a text built by committee, and that's why it's so uneven.
So with the Zohar being written around 1270, that's towards the end of the 13th century, and it was a while before one of the most important figures in the history of Kabbalah was born. His name was Isaac Luria. When did he live, and why is he important to Kabbalah?
Yeah, so what happens in the generation after the Sefer Zohar actually is that there is a huge debate among the people that know about it.
Yeah. I should mention, Sefer just means book. So the Sefer Zohar is the book of Zohar, or the Zohar book.
Yeah, the Book of Radiance. In fact, my second child's name is Zohar, which is funny because I really argued against that name because I thought it was too heavy, and my partner, my wife, was like, "Oh, I like that name. It's nice."
Hey, anything with a Z has to be a cool name.
It's a cool name. You get to have a Z in your name, and but yeah, it's I thought it was too heavy, and still do, but now we call them Zobear, which is a really great way of softening the
Yeah.
the edge of Zohar, which sounds so.
It does sound a little bit like, I mean, to an English speaking ear that's not familiar with the history of Judaism, Zohar could sound like an alien overlord bent on world domination.
It does have a sort of very otherworldly feel to it. It's the Z sound, right? And it's always in comic books, you get a Z or an X as the alien bad guy. And so, yeah. And if folks are curious, you can see the Zohar right there on my shelf. That's those black books. That's the books we're talking about. You can see there's about 5 volumes of it right there. In the English translation, it comes out to be 12 volumes. So it's a pretty substantial volume, pretty substantial text. Yeah. The Aramaic is very concise, and to translate it, you're having to do a lot of unpacking. That's why it sort of balloons in size.
Yeah, similar thing happens with, to give an illustration for some of the listeners, it's like in Latin. Latin has no word for the, and it frequently encodes information in a noun that we would use a preposition for, like of. So and for people who've taken Latin, I'm thinking of the genitive case here. So you would use the genitive case, just change the ending of a word to make it like of Bob instead of saying of Bob. That would just be one word. It would be a modification of Bob. And so when you translate Latin into English, it gets longer because you've got to add the, and where it's appropriate, you've got to add of, you've got to add other prepositions. And so it expands as you put it into English. And the same thing you're saying is happening with the Aramaic of the Zohar. Yeah.
And Latin's even better at that, right? Amasne. Do you love me? Like in one line, or pluit. It is raining. You can do it all in one word in Latin.
Yeah.
The Aramaic is a bit like that. Although what ends up happening in the Aramaic is it's less of the fact that it's driven by the case and the declension system. It's more that the terms are incredibly technical and have to be sort of not only just translated, but also explained as you go in many ways. So in that way, it greatly expands. And also, the footnotes in the standard edition of the Zohar will dominate the page, because the language can be so technical and obscure. But
so I'm sorry, getting back to Isaac Luria.
Right.
Who is he, and when did he live, and why is he important?
So Isaac Luria is one of these characters in history that manages to change the world in many ways without writing anything down. We think of Jesus and Muhammad and the Buddha,
Socrates.
Right? Socrates, yeah. All these characters that managed to make a huge dent in the world without writing anything down, which I have to learn to do that because, writing is, I got to learn that trick. But so Isaac Luria was a Kabbalist that came along a couple centuries after the Zohar. But to understand him, you have to understand one other major event, and that's 1492. Now, I know for most people, they hear 1492 and the mind goes to ocean, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And yes, Columbus did set sail in 1492. That's also the year the Alhambra Decree was completed, in which all Jews were required to either leave the Kingdom of Castile and Aragon, which is basically all of modern-day Spain, or convert to Christianity. That was the ultimatum they were given. And it was a disaster. I mean, you're talking about a situation where hundreds of thousands of Jews were either basically forcibly converted or expelled from Spain at the time. Now, one of the lesser-known heroes of that entire story is Bayezid II. Bayezid II doesn't get nearly the historical credit that he deserves, but Bayezid II was the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and he realized that the Jewish population of Spain was actually a very high-functioning population. They were doctors and lawyers and scribes and poets and scientists, because they weren't allowed to own land. Even during the Reconquista, Jews weren't allowed to own land, so they never became agricultural workers. They were urban.
The Reconquista is the Christian reclamation of the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain, from Muslim control, because Muslims had conquered it previously, and over a period of time, Christians retook that land, and that's called the Reconquista.
Right, which is funny because another form of Christians invited them in, which is always bookended. It's funny, bookended by Christians. It was the Aryan Christians that invited the Muslims in to protect them. And then the Muslims said, we're going to stay.
Yeah.
And so funny, be careful who you invite again, they might stay.
Like with the Maccabees, initially were allied with the Romans, and then the Romans a century later just take over.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah. Be careful when you make a deal with an empire. Just be sure that the empire will eventually win. That's a pretty good bet. So in 1492, the Jews are expelled. Bayezid II basically takes his entire flotilla over to Spain, and he gets as many Jews as he can, and he takes them over to the Ottoman Empire. Most of them settle in what is now Salonika. In fact, if you want a sense of how successful this population was, there were no printing presses in 1492. In 1493, there was one in Salonika. Right, you can see rapidly the Jewish population's really coming into its own, and there was a lot of religious toleration. Well, the Jews who had become very interested in Kabbalah were very convinced by this time that the end of the world was about to happen. They were convinced of the imminent arrival of the Messiah and the imminent end of the world. And it's not hard to believe the world's going to end when your world just kind of ended. And many of them who were very taken with the Kabbalah move in the Ottoman Empire. Remember that part of Greece and Palestine and all this area is just the Ottoman Empire. They all move to what is now the area of Sfat or Safed. And that is where Shimon Bar Yochai is traditionally said to be buried on the mountain there at Meron. And it's in that environment.
What country would that be in today?
Israel. It'd be in Israel. Yeah, it'd be in the Galilee.
Right.
Not far. I mean, from not far from the Sea of Galilee. You could 45-minute drive or something. So they settled there, and they began to intensely not only study Kabbalah, but teach it publicly for the first time. And they do that because they now think that the public teaching of the Kabbalah is going to be part of bringing the Messiah, right? So they think this is what's about to happen. We're about to usher in the Messiah, and the teaching the Kabbalah, right, for the first time in 3,000 years or whatever, is going to be the last thing we have to do. Well, as they're teaching the Kabbalah, it begins to get more and more systematized until the greatest system of it ever produced. One of the greatest systems is produced by a rabbi named Moshe Cordovero. Cordovero basically popularizes the Kabbalah in a way that no one else ever had before, and he dies. And on the day that he died, Isaac Luria arrived in Safed. In fact, Isaac Luria said that at the front of the funeral train of Moshe Cordovero, he could see the same pillar of God that had guided the Israelites in the desert, that it had returned.
Cool.
They were that close, right? This is the Messianic fervor, right? Literally, the pillar of fire has returned. And so what we have is a very weird situation where this otherwise unknown character, Isaac Luria, arrives in Safed. He lives there for a couple of years, and then he dies. He's only there for 2 years. And in that 2 years, he presents a vision of the Kabbalah so radical and so systematic that version basically sticks. And so in many ways, the Kabbalah, as anyone knows it, if you've ever heard the term Kabbalah, if you've ever heard of Kabbalistic concepts, that almost all of them are through this Lurianic lens. So without exception.
So Lurianic Kabbalism is now the dominant form of Kabbalism.
There are a few holdouts that hold on to Cordovero's system. I'm personally more convinced is not the right word. I'm more sympathetic to Cordovero's system, but I'm a real minority. Almost everybody who's anybody who says they study Kabbalah is studying the form of Kabbalah as taught by Isaac Luria. Now, Luria didn't write anything down. He just taught. And it was his students that ultimately wrote things down, and the collected works of Isaac Luria are actually really one of his students' works, a guy named Chaim Vital. And Chaim Vital systematized Kabbalah as we know it. His collected works are about 22 volumes-ish, and that is basically, those 22 volumes are now considered to be the standard expression of Kabbalistic ideas in Judaism.
So we're going to talk in a minute about what Kabbalists believe, but I want to complete one more element of their history first. Another major figure in the history of Kabbalah is a gentleman known as the Baal Shem Tov, which is Hebrew for the Lord of the good name, or the master with a good reputation, or however you want to translate it. Who is he, and when did he live? So
the Baal Shem Tov was a So there were a group of people called Balei Shemot, Lords of the Name. And these Lords of the Name were something like Jewish shamans living in Eastern Europe. Now, I know that sounds really weird, but they used Jewish mysticism and Jewish magic to heal people. They were sort of charismatic healers and preachers. They're called Balei Shemot because they would use combinations of God's name in various combinations to heal people. Think about disease as a lock, and you're using the various names of God to cure to pick the lock. And then you can heal people of disease. This is what the Balei Shemot were doing.
Kind of like in the New Testament, the apostles might say, be healed in the name of Jesus.
Yeah. And this idea of using a name of a god to affect change in the world goes back to the ancient Near East. It's ubiquitous in the ancient Near East. And so, yeah, same with in the name of in the exorcistic ritual that's still used in the Rituale Romanum, right? It's still, you're cast out in the name of by the power of the power of Christ compels you, the blood of the martyrs. It's like this very sort of repetitious thing. So the Baal Shem Tov was one of these charismatic Jewish shamanistic healers, and eventually he settled in Eastern Europe and developed a form of radical Jewish piety deeply infused with Kabbalah called Hasidism. And Hasidism, which means the pious ones. And these Hasidim eventually his students would fracture into different dynasties, and that would form the various world of Hasidic Judaism, which is a highly mystical, highly emotional, highly pietistic, and very Dianastic. If you've ever seen guys on the street in New York or in Israel with the long black coats and the very long peyot and the furry hats, shtreimels, almost all of those guys.
The peyot or the sidelocks.
The sidelocks, yeah. If you've ever seen those guys, they're probably Hasidic. Now, they have opponents called mitnagdim, which literally means the opposers. I tend to be on the opposer side. A good friend of mine is Hasidic, and I'm the token mitnag, the token non-Hasidic person. But Hasidic Judaism is deeply infused with Kabbalistic ideas, deeply infused. So much so that if you're walking on the street in New York on a random day, young Jewish guys might stop you, ask if you're Jewish, and if you are, ask you to put on tefillin, which are the boxes that go on the left arm and on the forehead, and then ask you to say a prayer. And they're doing that for Kabbalistic reasons.
Part of the repair of the world.
It's part of the repair of the world. Yeah, they think that they believe that the arrival of the Messiah is imminent, and it's just the right person doing the right commandment at the right time will sort of roll over the whole thing, and that'll unlock the Messiah. One can wonder about this theology, but that's what they believe. So
and they even have, some Hasidim even have proposed candidates for the Messiah, like the Schneerson.
Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson of blessed memory. And here I say, you can hear me say of blessed memory there, because I'm indicating that I believe that he's dead. There are members of one of these dynasties, the Lubavitch dynasty. There's a subset of those that do not believe he's dead. They believe he's simply hidden, and that he died in the 1990s, and that they believe he's hidden and he will reveal himself soon as the Messiah. There are active candidates for the Messiah in most of the Hasidic camps these days. What's called Mashiach Lador. Mashiach Lador is the idea that there is a potential Messiah, and these are all the potential Messiahs that exist. And that if things work out correctly, one of them will be activated, so to speak.
Sounds kind of like collapsing the wave function in quantum physics.
Quantum mechanics,
You've got all these possibilities, and then boom.
Boom, there's one of them, yeah. And in the 1990s, 80s, late 80s and 90s, the Chabad Lubavitch movement really did believe that they had the one. And to this day, I've met people who say things. I've studied in a yeshiva, a Jewish like seminary, and definitely met people there who were like, "Yeah, the Rebbe is the Messiah. He is hidden, and he will return soon and rule the world." I'm like, okay.
Now, back to the Baal Shem Tov real quick. We probably should clarify that's not his name. That's his nickname or his appellation.
Right.
His actual name was, to pronounce it the English way, would be Israel ben Eliezer.
Right.
And he lived in the 1700s, correct?
The 18th century, right?
Okay.
So what is now primarily the Ukraine, the Pale of Russia, the Ukraine, Podolia, that region. And the places that where he existed and lived are still sites of pilgrimage. They're not so easy to get to now. And he's also, sometimes you hear him referred to as the Besht, which is just you smash together Baal Shem Tov into one word and call him the Besht.
Okay. So we've kind of covered some of the major movements or shifts, I should say, in the history of Kabbalah. Let's talk about what Kabbalists believe. What do they believe about God?
All right. So this is where things get very complicated very fast.
And that's the end of this week's discussion with Dr. Sledge. Jimmy, what would you like to say before we close?
I'd like to thank Dr. Sledge for coming on. I think we had a really fascinating first part of the discussion. And next week, when we talk about the teachings of Kabbalah, it will be even more interesting. As Dr. Sledge pointed out, this is where things get very complicated very fast, and they also get really, really weird. So stay tuned for that.
Awesome. Jimmy, what further resources can the listeners and viewers check out before then?
We'll have links to information on Kabbalah, as well as Dr. Sledge's Esoteric channel, including his playlist on Kabbalah. He has a multi-part course on it, and we'll also have a link to his personal website.
Great. And so let's move on to our mysterious headlines. What are our mysterious headlines for the week?
Well, we're talking about the history of Kabbalah this time, and so we're talking about the history of the universe for mysterious headlines. We've got a cosmology theme and one that involves dark matter. We'll have a link to a story about dark stars, which are a proposal for what the first stars in the universe may have been. They, as people may know, dark matter is held to interact with ordinary matter gravitationally, and it's supposed to be responsible for the structure of large-scale things like galaxies and so forth. And there's a new theory, this is just a proposal, but there's a new theory that early in the universe, when everything was much more clumped together, that the dark matter would have been clumped together too, and there may have been hybrid dark matter, regular matter stars that were fueled not just by hydrogen fusion occurring, but also by dark matter annihilation. And so there's this theory that maybe the first stars in the universe were powered by, at least in part, by dark matter. There are hopes to use new telescopes to be able to verify that, and so you can read all about that. Also, speaking of dark matter, there has been a new particle discovered. Now, people will remember the Higgs boson that was discovered at the Large Hadron Collider a few years ago. Well, the Large Hadron Collider is a very big machine. You know, it spans miles, but on a tabletop machine, some scientists say they recently found a relation of the Higgs boson known as the axial Higgs boson, which is like the regular Higgs boson, but it also has a magnetic moment, so it interacts magnetically as well as gravitationally. And the axial Higgs boson is itself a dark matter candidate. So this could be the first evidence of a dark matter particle to actually be discovered. So you can read about that too.
Awesome. We'll have links in our show notes. So that's it from us this time. We would love to hear your theories about the origins of Kabbalah and its teachings. You can let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page. Send an email to mysterious@sqpn.com. Send a tweet to @MYS_world. You can join the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/Discord, where we have a channel just for the show, or call our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to thank the folks from Oasis Studio 7 for all the video and animation work they do here on Mysterious World. If you have any video editing needs, video animation needs, be sure to check them out. And you can check out their work by going to my YouTube channel at youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. We've been getting a lot of positive feedback about the added value that the video work they do brings to the program. And while you're at YouTube, be sure and subscribe to my channel. I'm trying to grow it. And so I'd really appreciate it if you like, comment, and subscribe and hit the bell notification so that you always get a new video notification whenever I have a video out, whether it's Mysterious World or something else.
Excellent. So, Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week, we'll be talking about the secret teachings of Kabbalah. According to Kabbalists, these were held secret for thousands of years, but now they're publicly known. So we'll be discussing what Kabbalists believe about God, the creation of the world, the origin of evil, the afterlife, and what they believe they need to do in order to fix everything.
Excellent. Folks, remember to share the podcast with your friends and write a review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from to help us grow this community and reach more listeners. You can find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion and links to the mysterious headlines in our show notes at mysterious.fm/218. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part through the generous support of our sponsors, including Aaron Ferguson Electric and Automation at aaronv.com, AARONV.com, making connections for life for your automation and smart home needs in North and Central Florida. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by Catechism Class, a dynamic weekly podcast journey through the Catechism of the Catholic Church by Greg and Jennifer Willits. It's the best book club, coffee talk, and faith study group all rolled into one. Find it in any podcast directory. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.